Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on breeding new cultivars for soil enhancing organic cropping systems. This webinar is part of the Organic Farming and Soil Health in the Western U.S. webinar series, organized by the Organic Farming Research Foundation with funding from Western SARE. I'm your host, Alice Formiga of eOrganic. eOrganic has many articles, videos, and webinars about organic farming and research, and you can find all of them by typing webinars by eOrganic into a search engine, and you can also find the recordings on the eOrganic YouTube channel. We're recording this webinar, and we will have the recording available on YouTube within 1 to 2 weeks. The presentation will last about an hour, and when it's over, we'll have 30 minutes for questions. If you have a question at any time during the webinar, feel free to type it into the Q&A box on your webinar control panel at any time. If you don't see the Q&A box, there should be a black bar with some controls at the bottom of your screen if you hover over it. And if you click on the Q&A one, that should pull it up. And you can also use the chat box, and you can share anything you like with the panelists and also with the attendees if you have any other resources that you'd like to share. So I'd like to welcome back the presenter of today's webinar series, Mark Schonbeck. Mark Schonbeck is a research associate at the Organic Farming Research Foundation, and he's worked for 31 years as a researcher, consultant, and educator in sustainable and organic agriculture. He's also been active in the Virginia Association for Biological Farming. For the question time after the presentation, he will be joined by Jared Zeistro, who is a Research and Education Assistant Director at the Organic Seed Alliance, and he's also a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin, but he lives in Arcata, California. And we also have with us Don Tilmani, who is a professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resources Economics at Colorado State University. So feel free to type in those questions during the webinar at any time. And welcome, Mark, Jared, and Don, and I'm going to hand over the remote control to Mark. And Mark, as a reminder, just click on that screen to activate it.
Okay, thank you. Welcome, everyone. This is one of my favorite subjects ever since I did an initial review of organic research with the Organic Farming Research Foundation and discovered some of the exciting work that's been done by farmers and university plant breeders to develop improved cultivars for organic systems. So I'll want to start by just reviewing some information that the Organic Farming Research Foundation gathered on research priorities for organic farmers. This is based on a 2015 survey in which 555 producers from the Western region, organic producers, participated. 71% of respondents considered soil health a top priority. And one of the interesting aspects of this that a lot of them are interested in is the interaction between plant roots and the soil microbiome or soil microbiota and how that relates to crop health. The next two top priorities for research were fertility management, which of course is related to soil health, and weed management, which is one of the big challenges in organic systems because when you're not using herbicides, you sometimes got to take the steel to the field and do some cultivation. So you're doing disturbing the soil surface at least to take those weeds out. So there was a lot of interest in varieties that don't require as much effort to control weeds. They compete better with weeds, and also varieties that don't need as much input for fertility. Or organic fertilizers get a little expensive. One farmer had there's one excellent quote from a farmer who said, "We really need varieties that have good root systems that interact well with the life in healthy soil, rather than cultivars that have been selected to survive and yield in rather biologically depleted soils that have been managed with conventional fertilizers." Some more research priorities that are particularly relevant to the West: water management, being prepared for drought, designing the system for drought resistance, and cultivar selection is part of that. Another aspect that has emerged in all the regions, but also in the West, is disease management. And this is an area where a lot of plant breeding and genetics has been done to develop resistance to specific diseases and overall resilience or tolerance to plant disease in general. And A couple of genetic related priorities under this heading that farmers mentioned was, of course, breeding plants for resistance to the major diseases in the region, and also developing rootstock for perennial crops that will bear that disease resistance. So we'll talk a little about how crop genetics can actually assist with improving soil health. And there are both direct and indirect ways that this can occur. For example, simply having cultivars that are easy to grow in one's region using organic practices makes it easier to adopt or continue with organic practices, and that alone, by not using strong synthetic crop protection chemicals or soluble fertilizers, and using other organic practices, that in itself will facilitate practices that improve soil health. And it also, if you have varieties that don't need as much input, that will reduce the impacts of cultivation. If you don't need as much cultivation for weed control, if you don't need as much irrigation, etc. And even though organic fertilizers are generally less harmful to the soil life and soil health, if you use large amounts, you can still run into situations where certain soil organisms are discouraged from being active and colonizing the plant roots in a beneficial way. And you can also get leaching and denitrification from heavy inputs of organic sources of nitrogen. And of course, heritable traits that confer disease and stress resilience, as I mentioned before. In the interior parts of the West, drought resilience, drought tolerance is particularly important. And whereas on the coast of the Pacific Northwest, the cool, wet soil conditions during the very rainy winter season pose a different kind of stress. The cultivar you see shown here at right is one that was developed by organic producers and breeders working together. It's called Abundant Bloomsdale. It's adapted to the Pacific Northwest. It combines cold hardiness and it's slow to bolt, so it also has excellent flavor. And of course, any cultivar that produces very high quality produce and has a lot of market appeal, that's going to very indirectly support soil health by supporting organic agriculture. There's nothing worse for the soil than the farm going out of business and the ground suddenly sprouting condos or warehouses or other urban development rather than any form of plant growth. So there are some heritable traits that more directly support soil health. A plant that grows rapidly, forms a heavy root system, and good surface coverage will reduce soil erosion and will tend to build organic matter and soil structure. And turns out that there are genetic variations in the capacity of crop plants to interact beneficially with soil life. So a lot of opportunities here. So breeding crops to need fewer inputs. Here's some this is an example of a sweet corn trial where they're selecting for lines and varieties that will thrive under dry farm conditions so that you can produce a good crop without irrigating or needing less irrigation. And when you reduce the amount of irrigation, one of the benefits is that you're less likely to leach nitrogen, less likely to create temporarily ponded conditions, like when you have to apply irrigation frequently. There's a short period in which the soil may be saturated, especially with something like furrow irrigation, and that can set back soil health a little bit. If you have crops that will efficiently utilize nutrients from organic sources, particularly very slow release sources such as a mixed species cover crop that's part legume, part grass, or a finished compost that has a moderate carbon to nitrogen ratio and a very slow release, or from organic matter itself, crops that can utilize nitrogen and other nutrients from those sources need less in the way of concentrated fertilizers such as chicken litter, feather meal, potassium sulfate, etc., all of which can stress soil life to some degree when used in large amounts. And then another way that crops can be bred to need fewer inputs is to increase their ability to outcompete weeds, and then you just need less cultivation. And that means you're saving soil organic matter and soil health. One thing to remember is all crops, not just cover crops, but any crop that grows a lot of biomass, that closes the canopy and forms a deep, extensive root system. All of these traits in any crop will contribute to soil organic matter, to feeding the soil life, and to preventing erosion. Abundant root exudates, as I say, that's sort of the that is the staple in the diet of many soil organisms, is what a living plant shares with the soil life every day, 10 to 20, maybe 30% of its photosynthetic product. And there can be more specific ways in which varieties differ in how well they associate with important beneficial organisms, such as mycorrhizal fungi. So let's look at one group of traits: vigorous high biomass cultivars. Basically, the more biomass you grow, the more organic matter you're adding. A vigorous, fast-growing crop will cover the ground quickly, will protect the soil surface both from compaction and raindrop impact, as well as erosion. And there's likely to be more root exudates that will sustain the soil life and continue to rebuild the tilth of the structure. So that even if you are cultivating a few times for weed control, or you're tilling, do one major tillage a year even, that heavy root exudate will be helping to regenerate the soil structure. And then, of course, you're building the total and active soil organic matter. Now, there is a trade-off here. How much of the plant's energy do you want to go into feeding soil life, protecting the surface, growing biomass, versus how much do you want to go into the edible part, be it grain or a broccoli head or tomato fruit, etc. And the way this trade-off has been expressed in the past, especially in grain crop breeding and grain crop agronomy, is something called harvest index. That's the ratio of the dry matter of what you take to market over the total dry matter of the plant. And back in the 20th century, the focus was breeding and managing for a high harvest index. You don't want the plant to be wasting energy on things other than what you're taking to market. Now the thought on that has changed. The thinking on that is changing, because we now know that all of this stuff that we don't take to market is not going to waste at all, but is enhancing soil health. So we're taking more and more breeders are taking a more balanced approach to this idea of harvest index. And the other thing to remember is, if you have a vigorous plant, it's more likely to sustain high yield, especially in the face of stresses such as drought or a little excessive rain or a cold night or a few pests or disease organisms that come along. If you've got a really vigorous plant, you're less likely to suffer significant yield loss from those stresses. Now let's look at a deep, extensive root system. The first thing that you have is the more root surface and the better association with mycorrhizal fungi and other soil life, the more efficient that plant is at taking out nutrients. This means two things. One is you don't need as much concentrated fertilizer to begin with. And secondly, if you do have a lot of soluble nitrogen around, the plant's going to use it up before it leaches to groundwater or otherwise adversely affects soil and environmental health. Another thing that these larger root systems do is they are very effective at building both active and stable organic matter. On the one hand, the fine roots and the root hairs and the exudates, this all together called rhizodeposition, is feeding the soil life and promoting the turnover and return of crop nutrients so that future crop growth can utilize it. And at the same time, root carbon, root organic matter is the most efficient in being transformed into more long-lasting organic matter. So you have a win-win here. Another thing is, the deeper the root system, the more you're going to be relieving hardpan and the more effectively you're going to retrieve nutrients. For instance, a crop that has a vigorous root system can actually remove all of the leached nitrate down to 5, 6, 7 feet depth. Crops such as pearl millet, that's a cover crop, but even production crops which are selected for a good root system can enhance that capacity to pick up deep nutrients. So it turns out that some of these valuable traits are clearly heritable. There was a review paper by Kelb in 2011. The details of all these references will be in the presentation notes that will be posted along with the archived webinar slides. It won't go into this in detail during the presentation itself, but all of these traits have shown genetically controlled variation. Cultivars vary. And I've seen this myself. I've been out transplanting lettuce and I say, wow, this red lettuce has a nice big root system. And then I'll just take out a different variety and I'll say, there's hardly enough root system for this one to get established. And I've seen consistent trends among varieties. And this has also been reflected on many crops in the literature. Root architecture as well, how dense the roots are, what their branching pattern is, how far they go laterally, and also the density of root hairs can vary. So if crop varieties are selected for deep and extensive root systems, you will build more soil organic matter. Like look at this Italian ryegrass over here. You can imagine that the soil life in every single cubic inch of soil is being abundantly fed throughout the top foot of the soil profile by daily exudates from this fine root system. This is a ryegrass cover crop. And so that'll enhance the beneficial soil biota, and it'll also improve this nutrient water use efficiency. If a crop can get down to 5 feet, it can use water effectively. One caveat I will mention that's easy to forget here in Virginia, where it rains 45 inches of rain every year, is that if you're trying to farm on 10 or 15 inches of rain, a dry farm, such as dryland grain production or dryland ranching, it can be important to consider the water use by some of these deep-rooted crops. And it turns out that some of them, such as alfalfa, are very greedy for water. So having alfalfa in an inappropriate place in the rotation can leave you seriously short of moisture for the next crop. On the other hand, pearl millet, even though it can also send roots down to 6 or 7 feet and clean up all the nitrate and break up all the hard pan, it is considered quite efficient in water use. So it's not as likely to thoroughly deplete the soil profile. However, as a general rule, a robust root system will improve the nutrient water use efficiency and reduce the need for those inputs, thereby facilitating organic production and also directly protecting soil health. So this is a fascinating area, this concept of teamwork with soil microbes. More and more research has come out elucidating the fascinating and complex ways in which plants and microbes signal to each other and then cooperate so that the plant is providing the microbial life with the organic carbon it needs. Basically, it's feeding it protein, carbohydrates, and fats from the plant photosynthate. And then the microbial life does several things. Some of it, such as the mycorrhizal fungi, improve crop access to nutrients. So these fungi will like double or triple the root system effectively. Others repel plant disease organisms or pathogens. Some of these will fix nitrogen. Of course, the legumes, they have an endophyte, rhizobia, that forms nodules on the roots and has a very tight symbiosis. However, some of the grasses, such as land races of corn and sorghum Sudan grass and pearl millet and several others, will foster nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the root zone, not necessarily as an endophyte, but here near the roots. Azospirillum, Azotobacter, et cetera, will increase in numbers. And again, it turns out, and then furthermore, there are special chemical signals that the crops can emit through the roots or that the organisms can emit to facilitate these mutualistic relationships. And again, there's been some genetic variation in plants' ability to do this. Okay, we'll look at a few research examples, get into some of the details of this. Nitrogen efficient field corn, Mondamin Institute. This is not in the Western region, but I believe this work is relevant to corn production everywhere. Dr. Walter Goldstein at Mondamin Institute and his colleagues have collected land races of corn from Central America and Mexico that are very effective at utilizing nitrogen from organic sources, such as soil organic matter or finished compost. And in addition, they host nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the root zone sufficient to fix anywhere from 10 to 50% of the corn's nitrogen requirement. So these two traits mean that any farmer, organic or otherwise, is going to save a lot of money on fertilizer. And they have crossed these land races with corn belt hybrids and produced new hybrids with these nitrogen efficiency and nitrogen fixing traits. They produce similar yields to the conventional hybrids, and the protein content and quality is actually superior. And here is a trial on a very, very poor tropical soil in Africa, which is known to be low in phosphorus and low in soluble nitrogen, and somewhat droughty region as well. And this is a standard corn belt hybrid. And on the right is one of the new lines that Mondamin Institute has developed by crossing the land races with non-GMO hybrids to create new hybrids that have this trait and also have the high yield potential of the standard hybrids. So that potential is now maintained in the presence of low soil nitrogen. Okay, so another example, growing tomatoes on less water. Tomatoes are considered fairly drought tolerant here in the east because they have a deep root system, goes down 4 or 5 feet, can sustain themselves through several weeks of dry weather. In dry summer regions such as California, especially the more interior areas where the total rainfall is not that high, they are typically grown with lots of irrigation. Farmers have found that if you choose varieties that are especially adapted to drought conditions, such as early girl and new girl, and give them less irrigation, you improve the quality of the tomato. You have a higher dry matter content, better flavored tomato, and you don't need as much irrigation. You don't have as much yield. You don't have much yield loss either. So you have a tomato with better market appeal. And this is a trial conducted by a network called, it's at UC Davis. It's a student collaborative organic plant breeding and education. And that's an example of participatory plant breeding, which we'll get into later in the presentation. But the SCOPE project here is conducting a trial of different tomato cultivars and lines and growing them with no or minimal irrigation in Central California, pretty dry conditions. And you can see that some of the entries have more or less died out, whereas others are maintaining substantial growth. So this is another example of genetic variation in water efficiency and drought tolerance, which can be utilized to develop improved varieties for organic production, and particularly in the Western region. At Washington State University, Dr. Kevin Murphy and others are working with several specialty grains, barley, quinoa, some millets, buckwheat, etc. The advantage of the interest in these crops is partly because they are relatively high biomass. They return, as you can see, they return quite a lot of dry matter to the soil after that grain is harvested out. And this is an important consideration for vegetable growers because vegetable crops are very low residue. In fact, if you're going to take salad carrots or beets or turnips or daikon to market, you often take the whole plant. So you're leaving basically nothing except whatever the roots exuded into the soil before the crop was harvested. Even crops like squash and tomato, the residues left behind are relatively light. So it's important for these growers to try to insert cover crops into the rotation. But if they're dealing with limited land area and really can't forego the income to grow cover crops, one alternative is to grow crops that can be harvested, and a specialty grain can make some decent income and yet return a lot to the soil. So Dr. Murphy and others at Washington State are not only looking at these systems from an agronomic viewpoint, but also are breeding and selecting these grain crops for organic production with an emphasis on drought resistance, weed tolerance, and resistance to prevalent diseases. We know that there's a tremendous genetic capacity to breed for drought tolerance, because for many decades, international breeding programs that work with cereal grains, corn, rice, and dry beans have actually selected drought-tolerant cultivars in so-called managed stress nurseries. They take different lines and plant them, and they deliberately subject them to a moderately severe drought stress. And anything that doesn't yield well under those, goes on the compost pile, and the stuff that yields well gets saved and crossed and improved over successive years of breeding and selection. So the potential for breeding for these traits is quite substantial. And here's an example from a project that's been funded now twice through the Organic Research and Extension Initiative, looking at carrot improvement for organic agriculture. And there's a number of breeding objectives in this project, looking at early emergence in seedling vigor. Getting carrots to establish is the hardest step in carrot production. And the other one is managing the weeds in these slow starting crops. So another trait is canopy height and density for weed suppression. However, there are a couple of pests and diseases that attack carrots too. So they're looking at resistance to leaf blight. And I'll just have a very quick digression here to my own experience as a gardener here in Virginia. My favorite cultivar carrot is called Danvers. There's Danvers, early Danvers, Danvers half long, Danvers 126. They all share this trait of having a nice big top, which means that not only do they have more photosynthetic energy to build a large and sweet root, but they crowd out the weeds sooner, and I only have to cultivate once rather than twice, or twice rather than 4 times. And then I learned after a while, I started seeing them just turn black and kind of fail and give me a really poor yield. And then I learned that they were coming down with alternaria leaf blight. Well, one of the things that the Carrot Improvement for Organic Agriculture has done, made significant progress toward, is identifying and breeding and selecting new carrot lines that have both of these traits. They're resistant to leaf blight, and they form that dense canopy. The reason I was running into trouble is the dense canopy held in the moisture, didn't dry out as fast in the sun, and they came down with the leaf blight a little faster. But by taking an integrated approach of looking at multiple traits, CIOA is making really important progress towards excellent new varieties for organic. Other traits that they're working on are resistance to pest nematodes. There's 2 different kinds of root knot nematodes that really make a mess of carrots, make them all kinds of weird shapes and knobby and not marketable, even though they taste just as good, etc. And then beneficial interactions with soil microorganisms, not only mycorrhizal fungi, but there's an organism that enhances the carrot's resistance to this leaf blight. Very interesting phenomenon, which we'll go into a little bit more in a few minutes. And of course, they're paying attention to flavor, nutritional value, and other interesting market traits such as color. They're selecting purple carrots that have some or all of these traits. They're selecting yellow carrots, or red carrots, all the different varieties that customers like to see at the farmer's market. This is a farmer participatory breeding project with major hubs of activity in California and Washington, as well as in the North Central region. So this is actually from my garden. It's that favorite variety of mine, which unfortunately is not all that tolerant to the leaf blight. But this is a quote that I really like from one of the progress reports to OREI from this project. That lines that emerged and formed a full canopy resulted in the greatest crop yield in the presence of weeds and the ability to suppress weeds. So that simply breeding for these traits and selecting for these attributes is considered an excellent low input integrated weed management tool. In other words, less cultivation, healthier soil. And several researchers in this particular project team have been looking at some interesting interactions between the plant and the soil microbes. And there's definitely genetic variation in this ability to host rhizosphere and endophytic microbes. Now, these are microbes such as Pseudomonas bacteria that live inside the root tissue, and they induce the plant to become more resistant to a leaf blight, which is a phenomenon called induced systemic resistance. The action's happening in the root tissue, and presto, the leaves are now less susceptible to this very serious carrot disease. Another thing that these same organisms and some different organisms do is they enhance nutrient uptake and overall crop growth. And again, that means you don't need as much fertility, maybe not even need as much water to sustain the crops yields you need. And the efficacy and the species specificity of association with these AMF fungi, which is so important for nutrition and drought tolerance, that has also been shown to have significant genetic variation and opportunity to select, breed and select for improved mycorrhizal efficacy. Okay, here's another project funded by the Organic Research and Extension Initiative. It's called TOMI, or Tomato Organic Management and Improvement. Tomatoes are susceptible to a huge roster of nasty diseases, especially a lot of them affecting the foliage, late blight, early blight, septoria, a couple of bacterial speck and bacterial spot attack the leaves and the fruit. So one of the top priorities for organic tomato production is disease management. So they're looking at an integrated pest management approach that includes breeding for multiple disease resistance and this induced systemic resistance, combined with the use of biofungicide. Now, these are microbial antagonists that you can either spray on the crop or either apply to or encourage in the soil that directly attack the microbes. And then they're using some new formulations of copper that don't require as much of this heavy metal. It's a micronutrient, but you get too much, it can degrade soil quality and become a bit of a pollutant. So if you can use just a little tiny bit of copper and keep your tomato crop free of disease, that would be great. So this whole integrated approach is a lot of role for breeding here. They found our project has already identified, in addition to genetic variation in disease resistance, of course, and the ability to show this ISR response, which I'll go into in a moment. They've also found genetic regulation of nutrient use efficiency and the ability to exclude toxic metals when they're grown in urban soils. There's an organism, fungal organism called Trichoderma harzianum. It actually has multiple functions in the soil microbiota. One thing it does is that it can parasitize and directly kill a number of plant pathogens. It also will grow, it'll grow in or near the roots of the tomato plant and induce this systemic resistance in the foliage. And it turns out that the wild relatives of tomato and old land races that have been grown for many centuries show the greatest response, whereas varieties developed in the 20th century, and even some heirloom varieties that were developed, say, in the 19th century, seem to have lost this ISR response. Now, the trichoderma still improves overall growth and nutrient use efficiency in all of these varieties, but the specific response of increased resistance to foliar diseases decreases. Now, in some of the modern lines that are being developed through the TOMI project and other breeding efforts, they're beginning to see that ISR response come back. So by breeding and selecting in and for organic systems, we can restore this capacity. This project is also taking the approach of developing horizontal resistance to multiple diseases. If you just select for a gene that gives immunity to disease through one gene, that's called vertical resistance. And a pathogen such as Phytophthora infestans, a cause of late blight, can rapidly evolve around that, so you lose that resistance. So the idea is instead to create more multiple mechanisms, including ISR, to build that resistance to disease. Again, disease-resistant tomatoes give you more yield and need less copper. Again, that will benefit soil health. This is a different project which validates what I was saying earlier about genetic regulation of nutrient use efficiency. There are 3 patterns of nutrient cycling. This is a study of tomato fields, organic tomato fields in Central California. They found 3 distinct patterns. Fields that were nitrogen deficient, the soluble nitrogen was low, it was below 6 parts per million nitrate nitrogen, which means very little risk of either leaching to groundwater or denitrification into the powerful greenhouse gas nitrous oxide. But there was also low yield. The yields were limited by that low nitrogen. A number of fields were nitrogen saturated. They were loading on the chicken litter and other and guano and other concentrated organic nitrogen sources, and they raised the soluble nitrogen to higher levels and got high yields, but there was a significant risk of leaching and possibly denitrification. There was a third pattern, 4 fields that were managed mostly with a finished compost with a moderate carbon to nitrogen ratio and a very slow release of nitrogen, and that tended to help build stable organic carbon. They were also growing high biomass cover crops that further built up the stable organic matter carbon and the total microbial activity in that soil. And lo and behold, because they were using only a small amount of fast release nitrogen right in the crop row, they had low bulk soil soluble nitrogen at 6 parts per million or less. And if you ask any crop nutritionists and mainstream crop scientists, they'll say, well, that's going to give you yield limiting nitrogen. But these crops were able to obtain the nitrogen they needed. They gave you high yield and had little nitrogen leaching risk. And this was as a result of an interaction between soil life and specific enzymes in the plant roots that facilitated the release of nitrogen right in the root zone where the crop could take it up before it had a chance to leach or denitrify. Because these plant enzymes are under genetic control and these genes are widespread in the plant kingdom and occur in many crop plants, this concept of tightly coupled nutrient cycling can easily be applied to other crops and to breeding programs therefore. All right, well, cover crops. Well, we know cover crops, what are they grown for? Soil health and soil conservation and soil fertility. And it turns out that a lot of the key traits that you're looking for in a good cover crop show quite a bit of genetic variability among varieties within a crop. Vigor and biomass, nitrogen fixation, cold hardiness, which is important if you want a winter cover crop that's going to hang in there and then grow in the spring and give you what you need. Flowering date. This is critical, especially if you are using no-till or minimum till methods to terminate the cover crop. You can only kill an annual cover crop by roll crimping after it comes into full bloom. And the other thing is there are some varieties that are harder to roll crimp whether or not they're blooming. And then, of course, there is the whole issue of weed suppression, another major reason for growing cover crops. So you don't need as much tillage for the weeds. And the cover crop's own resistance to diseases and pest nematodes. And their water use efficiency has been shown to be genetically controlled. Again, we want very efficient cover crops in terms of water so that they don't use up all the soil water if you're working with limited moisture. So here's just a cover crop of oats and vetch. You can see that that is giving you an excellent cover there. There's a lot of nitrogen and carbon in there, a lot of soil food going into the soil life every day. So some heritable traits that have been documented and utilized. Bell bean, there's some breeding going on by Eric Landry and colleagues at Washington State University. Bell bean is a small-seeded fava bean. Most strains of fava beans will winter kill somewhere between 15 and 20 degrees Fahrenheit. They found some lines that will easily survive temperatures in the single digits below zero, and even showed partial survival 30 to 40% at 12 degrees below zero. So this is these new lines are going to be very useful in the interior part of Washington State, where the winter is when all the moisture occurs and there could be some very cold nights. Hairy vetch, known to be hardy to below zero, but when you get up in the northern Midwest, very often it will winter kill. And they found that the farmers who are saving their own seed within Minnesota, their seed is much more tolerant to the extreme cold in Minnesota than seed purchased as close by as Illinois, to the next state further south. Another trait that's important is maturity date. Purple Bounty hairy vetch matures 2 weeks earlier and is relatively easy to roll crimp. This was discovered by some farmers at Windy Acres Farm in central Tennessee. They are growing grains organically with no or minimum tillage, and they're roll crimping their winter cover crops. And they found that Abruzzi rye and Purple Bounty vetch mature early and can be terminated relatively easily in time to plant their corn. Another OREI-funded project is breeding cover crops for organic systems. And although the principal investigator is Dr. Steve Mirsky at USDA ARS in Beltsville, Maryland, they have sites all across the United States, including Washington and other places in the West. The project objectives were based on farmer priorities. And again, you see the list of cover crop traits that are desired in a good cover crop: nitrogen fixation, winter hardiness, biomass, early vigor, weed suppression. And this is very important. You want your cultivar adapted to your region. And the other thing, the project also intends to launch a long-term endeavor. So that that's one thing about plant breeding. It takes time. You're not going to go from idea to marketable variety in a 3 or 4 year grant. The methods again include farmer participatory breeding and evaluation, and research station and on-farm trials in all 4 major regions of the in the United States. And they're using NRCS plant materials in 9 states, and they're doing seed increases in Washington State and in Texas. So let's talk about some of the challenges in finding the best crop cultivars for building soil and making a living organic farming. Number one is a lot of today's varieties just are not adapted to organic systems, and cultivars are productive under the conditions for which they were bred. And if you select them in fields that get lots of synthetic fertilizer and herbicides and pesticides, they will not perform well in organic systems. And to me, one of the most telling examples is broccoli. Broccoli requires over 200 pounds per acre of nitrogen from organic sources in order to give optimum yield. And yet, half of that nitrogen is lost to leaching and or to denitrification. In fact, one modeling study suggested that the amount of nitrous oxide resulting from this denitrification in California would easily cancel out any carbon sequestration that you could achieve through the best cover crop combined with the best minimum till practice that you can imagine. So this brings, all of this brings up to a really interesting question. Have modern cultivars forgotten how to interact with soil life? And that's a result of selecting these nutrient-saturated fields. The mycorrhizae go dormant. In fact, phosphorus is raised to very high levels through either organic or synthetic fertilizer inputs. Now, this can happen with manure as well, but certainly in synthetic systems, they basically say, well, we're not needed, and they go to sleep, and their numbers diminish greatly. Nitrogen-fixing organisms are not going to proliferate in the root zone if the soil is already saturated with nitrate nitrogen. And there's been a number of studies that showed a significant trend towards modern cultivars not having as great a capacity to signal to beneficial organisms including organisms that repel diseases and pests, as well as ones that enhance nutrient uptake. So another challenge that we're faced with is that the cultivar choices are limited. They're often not adapted to locale, and that's because of seed industry consolidation, resulting in private breeders focusing on large acreage commodity crops like corn and soybeans. And so the minor and specialty crops receive less attention. And meanwhile, the commodity crops, a lot of them today are not suitable for organic production because they are genetically modified and are not permitted. And organic seeds, one of the findings in that survey that conducted by Organic Farming Research Foundation that I mentioned at the beginning is that farmers are getting pretty frustrated with the quality of organic seed. They say it's expensive, the quality is inferior, and the cultivars don't seem to thrive under organic systems. And one of them just said the genetics are horrible. And if they can just find conventional seeds that are not GMO and not treated, they'll always out-yield the organic lines. And another example is a lot of today's wheats are short in stature. They have small root systems, and they end up with a lower protein content, and they need more nitrogen to sustain yields. And that was that same farmer that was really urging breeders to look at developing crops with robust root systems that really interact with those soil organisms in a healthy soil. Another thing is the plant breeder, the public plant breeder is becoming an endangered species, and that's because of diminished funding, a lot of privatization of plant breeding efforts. And so there's really an urgent need to recruit and train and bring on the next generation of plant breeders. And I want to acknowledge Organic Seed Alliance for taking the lead on this. This is an OSA plant breeder working with, looks like some crop in the brassica family, though I'm not for certain there, and doing a cross to develop new lines. So another one that we have, another challenge is the whole issue of intellectual property and farmers' rights. There's one breeder for Vetch seeds. I like what he said. I wish my work not to be shared, not monopolized. He's been developing lettuce, new lettuce lines for Vetch seeds. There is an open source seed initiative, which exemplifies this principle of making sure that farmers are free to grow, share, sell, or trial and study any seed that's produced under this initiative. Any new variety that's issued under open source can be used in any of these ways. And there's only one requirement, that anything developed from Aussie germplasm must remain open source. And there's one challenge with this is, okay, it's all open source, you can just use it, but how do we make sure that the breeders, whether they be farmers or researchers, make a decent living at doing their most invaluable work of producing the varieties we need? So that comes up to, how do you make sure that there is enough money to continue the plant breeding effort? You can set up a license agreement so that whenever farmers buy seed, there's a royalty, maybe 10%, that goes back to support the breeding effort. A lot of university programs attempt to do this. Unfortunately, not all of the funds that are collected in those royalties really go back into the breeding program, and that is a bureaucratic issue that needs to be worked out, and about which I do not know a whole lot in detail, so I won't spend any more time on that. There's something called the Plant Variety Protection Act. This is an intellectual property restriction placed on new varieties developed by breeders that allows the farmer to save seed and select seed, or farmers or other breeders to use the PVP variety to develop new lines. The only limit is you can't just grow this variety and sell it, sell the seed. You can grow the variety and sell the fruit, but you can't sell the seed. So that's the only restriction. It's really not really as, now the utility patent, this is really what we want to avoid. This is what happens with genetically modified seeds. It costs $100 million or more to develop a genetically modified crop variety. Compare that to a few $100,000 to perhaps $1 million to develop a really good open pollinated, publicly available variety. So these firms, they have to recoup their investment. So they slap on a utility patent. The farmer can't even save his or her own seed. And if it accidentally happens, a farmer can get into trouble. And then germplasm use by researchers is severely restricted. Okay, let's talk about meeting the challenges. Farmer participatory plant breeding. This is what got me most excited when I read about some of these projects funded by Organic Research and Extension Initiative. Farmers work with scientists. They set the priorities, evaluate breeding lines, and develop and release new cultivars. The Organic Seed Alliance has some excellent programs for training farmers in both breeding and seed production. The OREI funds a number of participatory plant breeding endeavors that includes the TOMI and the Carrot Improvement for Organic Agriculture project that I mentioned earlier. One of the things that these programs tend to focus on is selecting for multiple priorities rather than just focusing on a single trait. You heard me sing the praises of deep, extensive root systems, but if you select just for that, you could lose flavor, or you could lose sufficient top growth to sustain the yield, or, you know, you really have to take that balanced, integrated approach. And this approach, the participatory approach, is excellent for that. Another OREI funded project is the Northern Organic Vegetable Improvement Collaborative. It's working on several leading vegetable crops. Here are a few cultivars that have been developed through that project: broccoli, Solstice, and Myers Best, several butternut squash, tomato iron lady, which I've grown here in Virginia. It is indeed pretty resistant to 3 major diseases. Brandy Wise, which is the heirloom brandy wine with some disease resistance. Sweet corn, and here's three varieties that are getting to be pretty well known. There's lots more on the way. And this is the Student Collaborative Organic Breeding and Education Program at UC Davis. The students and faculty work with local farmers in the same way to develop cultivars for organic breeding. And they're looking at 7 new common bean cultivars ready for testing and hopefully be on the market pretty soon. They're also working on tomato, pepper, lima bean, and they're continually expanding into new crops and regions. And they're collaborating with Organic Seed Alliance, and it's an excellent opportunity for farmers who want to engage in participatory plant breeding. Researchers are really excited about this whole approach. There's one research that was quoted in a report by Kiki Hubbard and Jared Zistro a couple of years ago, and it said more than 70% of the organic seed research projects involve farmers, and one researcher shared that we could not do this without farmer involvement. They're required partners. There are a few challenges. Farmers have to learn new skills. I sometimes thought about getting into it myself and just didn't have the time to learn all those skills that were involved in breeding, selecting, making sure the seeds are good quality and are stored properly, and etc. And we must make sure that farmers who do this valuable work do receive sufficient compensation. And that can be a fundraising challenge and an intellectual property rights challenge. And also, it takes a long time to go from idea to new public cultivar. It takes 4 to 10 years. And to go from farmer-ready seed to actually have enough of it to bring to market and enough promo to let the farmers know it's out there, that can take another couple of years. So a few tips for finding what you need out there in the way of seeds. If you're like me and you just don't have the time and the skill for plant breeding, but I want to grow some good vegetables for our kitchen garden, or someone else like me wants to make a living doing some market farming, start looking for locally produced seeds. If they're grown locally, they're more likely to be adapted to the region, not only genetically, but also epigenetically. You can take the same variety and grow it for 3 years here in Virginia, and grow it for 3 years in a row in drier conditions in Central California or in Utah, and they will adapt in the way they respond to the different soil microbiomes and different climatic stresses in those 2 different regions. Definitely choose cultivars that are bred in and for organic systems. Thanks to Organic Seed Alliance and a number of small seed companies, these are gradually becoming more available. And when you're looking through the catalog, think in terms of these traits that emerge and establish rapidly, they compete with weeds, resistances to the most important diseases or pests in your region, efficient utilization of organically derived nutrients, and tolerance to drought, especially for interior parts of the West and to other stresses. Another thing, always conduct on-farm variety evaluations and do it for a few years in a row. This can really tell you what's going to work in your farm. And 1 year's data can be a little misleading. If you try something, you get a super dry year or a super wet year, you may get a different result in a normal year. Okay, sourcing and choosing organic seed. This is the research, this is the Soil Health and Organic Farming Guide published by Organic Farming Research Foundation, on which this webinar is based. I have a few new items in the webinar, but this will cover and go into greater depth than many of the things that I'm kind of skating over today. There's a directory of organic seed suppliers that's offered by the ATRA. Organic Seed Alliance is also an excellent source. And there's some vendors that provide really great information on the cultivar traits. This Blue River Organic Seed, they offer seeds for agronomic crops, grains. And they list a number of traits on a 1 to 5 scale. Early vigor, root strength, basically the robustness of the root system, and tolerance to various stresses, including both dry and cold and too wet, etc. So the next step is to get involved, breed and grow better seeds for organic farms. Learn the skills, and then whatever your varieties you find that you really like, you could start by saving and selecting seeds from those favorite cultivars. You want to use non-patented seed. The Aussie seed or local seed is best. If it's Plant Variety Protection Act, you could still work with that, as long as you're not just turning around and selling the seed grown straight from the PVP variety. Local seed swaps, conservation groups like the Seed Savers Exchange, excellent resources. You can also contract with a local seed company to grow organic seed or evaluate some of their breeding lines or cultivars on your farm. And then the next step is to get into participatory plant breeding. And again, Organic Seed Alliance is an excellent resource for participatory plant breeding, manuals, workshops, trial information, proceedings of organic seed growers conferences that are held every 2 years. And they also offer technical support for farmer-led projects, and it can provide breeding populations that you can use for on-farm selection. This is an example of a breeding project that led to that excellent variety of spinach I showed you earlier. Here's some more resources. Experimental Farm Network. It's nationwide. It's open source. It's looking at upland rice, perennial grains, and beans. And I mentioned these projects before. To get involved with any of these, you can contact Jared Zistro, who's on the webinar with us. Also Kevin Murphy for Western Region Specialty Grains. Here's a few seed companies with participatory plant breeding programs in the area. Most of these are vegetables, but they're worth looking into. Most of them are more in the Pacific Northwest. There may be some more in and in California. There may be some also inland. Okay, we'll quickly go over a few recent developments, and then I'll turn it over for questions and answers. So USDA continues to fund, through the Organic Research and Extension Initiative, plant breeding for organic systems. And you can see by the wording of the priority that it's been fine-tuned to really emphasize the traits that organic farmers need in their seed, including the capacity to perform in soil improving production systems such as organic minimum till. As word as no-till here. It's really usually reduced tillage or rotational no-tillage at this point. However, cover crops have also been added and as a priority. And the good news is that in the 2018 awards, the Novik project received its third round of funding. So that'll really allow it to follow through and bring a number of their breeding lines to market. Cover crop breeding has received continuation funding, a second grant, so this project will move ahead. And more good news, the 2018 Farm Bill granted permanent funding by ramping up the OREI annual funding up to $50 million by 2023. The RFAs for this year and next year have been issued. Applications are due this May and the next January. And looking into the near future, just a few promising cultivars in the pipeline. There are tomatoes that are resistant to 7 major diseases. These include early blight, late blight, septoria, bacterial speck, bacterial spot, and 2 root diseases, verticillium wilt and fusarium wilt. Improved red and purple carrots. I'm not clear as to what all traits they include, but certainly the market traits and probably some of the weed and pest resistance traits. They have carrot breeding stock resistant to 2 major pest nematodes, which will be used in further breeding programs. There are several new sweet corn varieties in the pipeline, especially one specifically adapted to the Olympic Peninsula, which with its tremendously heavy winter rainfall and brief sunny, dry summer can be quite challenging for growing a crop such as sweet corn. And there are new varieties of cabbage, pepper, squash, tomatoes also through the Novik program. All right.
All right, thank you, Mark. I'm going to get started on all the questions here. So let's see. First question is your implication that the most vigorous plants require the fewest inputs? Does that also hold true under stress?
Jared, I'll let you comment on that.
Okay, so repeating the question, just to frame it in my mind, the most vigorous plants require the least inputs. I think that might depend on how you term vigor. I think that there's vigor can kind of be in I apologize, Mark maybe defined it better, but in my mind I can see it being there's vigor in terms of the ability to respond to favorable environmental conditions with kind of rapid growth, and there's also the ability to remain have the capacity to grow in poor conditions. So, I think that the context of vigor would depend. Certain traits that include things like Mark mentioned in terms of having strong root systems and the capacity to extract nutrients from the soil in water from the soil under low conditions, are things that can provide vigor both under low input and moderate input. I don't know if that's really answering your question, but I guess the often the case is that in general there aren't easy generalizations. So different crops may perform vigorously or perform well. An individual variety may perform well in high input and low input, and may perform well in high input but not in low input, and it might perform well in low input but not high input. You'll see
okay.
all those circumstances. It's
okay.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add, that's a really good question, because if you select for vigor in terms of just a visible above ground biomass and yield, in high input conditions, you're slathering on 200 pounds of synthetic nitrogen, you're protecting the crop against every known disease and pest with crop protection chemicals, you're giving it all the irrigation you need. You will end up selecting crops that respond to those conditions and show tremendous vigor when you roll out the red carpet. But if you try to grow them sustainably in terms of environmental impact, or you try to grow them organically, they probably will underperform, and they may start out growing really vigorous and then succumb to a disease, or they may be extremely drought sensitive, or they may be simply incapable of utilizing nitrogen from compost and green manure.
Okay. Let's see. We had a comment from someone about how it seems like there's a rapidly growing need for more regional breeding programs, and he's interested in getting more going. So how would somebody go about doing that if they were interested? Should they contact the Organic Seed Alliance? Would that be a good first start there?
Definitely. I think that it would, yes, certainly take a look at seedalliance.org at our website. We have a ton of resources and publications, and you can get in touch with us directly. My email, jared@seedalliance.org. We can probably plug you into some existing networks in your region that you may or may not already be aware of. I think in terms of how to get started, a lot will come from where you're coming from. Are you a farmer that's interested in doing more on-farm breeding? Are you a university researcher? Are you someone who's, neither a farmer nor, affiliated with a university but wants to participate in some way? So some of, how you get started will depend on where you're coming from and what you're, what tools you're already have.
And this is Dawn Thomany chiming in. I've been responding to someone just because they happen to be in my state of Colorado, but the OREI program was mentioned several times as being a great resource for us to tap into to get some targeted organic research done. But preceding that, we had the SARE program, which would still be a really good fit, and particularly for the question that got posted, which is about getting some of these regional plant breeding programs in line that are well suited to whatever conditions you are growing in. I know at least the Southern and Western SARE research grant program proposals are out right now. Again, those regional ones might even be better given the context that was shared here today, that sometimes what you have to do does have to be very place specific. And so it may be slightly harder to compete in that national OREI grant program, but we still have the SARE research programs out there as well to help pilot and do some comparing and contrasting of if some of these findings we even saw here on the webinar today would hold true in the places you all are producing. And I'm probably speaking too boldly for OFRF here, but I'm sure as you write up your justification and motivation for those grants, using these webinars and what you've learned on them and what they've already compiled for really valuable information, in a way they've kind of written part of the grant for you, because you just be basically saying now you want to actually look at how that approach from one of these other projects that was listed today, how it translates to the region you're growing in with, a set of producers, and hopefully pulling in either someone from a land grant or from a research institution that is in your area.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Yeah, someone else have something to add?
Yeah, this is Mark. I just wanted to add that OREI has 3 tiers of grants that they issue. One is up to $500,000, and that's for what they call a targeted proposal. So it could be very specific. You could have something like, breeding tomatoes that tolerate the high humidity of the Pacific Northwest, or dryland grains for Montana and North Dakota. Then they have the regional proposals up to $1 million. So you could even have a regional network. Now, Novik and the other ones, Carrot Improvement, et cetera, were multi-regional. So they went for the largest grant type, which was multi-region up to $2 million. But I just want to point out that there are grant types that are awarded under OREI that are intended for that more regional focus.
Okay, great. And I think that this person is going to be in touch with you, Dawn. So it sounds like we've made a connection here, which is exciting. Continuing on with the question, someone had posted a question about the antagonism, whether there's antagonism between certain fungi and mycorrhizae, and Jared put some resources about that in the chat box there. So that's why he put those resources there. So hopefully that helped answer the question. Okay, we have a question about GMOs, about whether that you think they're here to stay or whether it's just a phase that will end eventually.
I'll let you tackle that one, Jared.
Sure thing. So I think the short answer is that I expect that genetic engineering tools, whether they're the ones that we've seen in their current incarnation or more of the recent biotechnology tools like gene editing and CRISPR, are going to continue to be a part of, some part of the plant variety development. So I don't expect that they will go away. I do expect that well, maybe this is just my own worldview, but I feel like in conversations with scientists and plant breeders, both in the conventional and organic world, that the luster of GMOs has gone away. They're not necessarily seen as, that everything can be solved with genetic engineering, that classical plant breeding, the kind of breeding that Mark's been talking about, where you're making selections based on what you're seeing in the field, based on growing it in the, in real agricultural conditions, that is becoming revalued, I would say, within the plant breeding community, both, commercially, conventionally, organically, and within universities. So not going away, but I also think that there continues to be a strong place for non-GMO breeding.
Okay. Let's see, is Novik or anyone else taking the lead on developing participatory breeding farmer training workshops so that more farmers would feel equipped to participate in breeding programs? Jared, do you know of any efforts like that?
Yes. So every year, Organic Seed Alliance and other partners in Novik, as well as through some of our other projects that we work on, puts on many both remote trainings and in-person trainings for participatory plant breeding. So if you go to our website, we will usually have a calendar of events, of field days that are happening. We're going to have every year we have a Novik specific, what we call a plant breeding intensive. That's usually 2.5 days and is cycled around through the country. This upcoming one will be in the West. It's either going to be up in Washington or down in California this coming fall. We haven't quite nailed down the date and location, but that will be there. And then also there are just a ton of already pre-recorded webinars and publications that we have for trainings. And last plug would be that we have an organic seed growers conference that happens every 2 years. The next one will be coming up next February, and that will have a ton of workshops that are geared towards farmers who are interested in engaging in plant breeding. And a lot of those workshops, thanks to eOrganic and Alice here, have been recorded and will be recorded. So you can look for some of those archives on the eOrganic site or on YouTube or on OSA's site. And even if you can't make it to the one, our Seed Growers Conference next year, some of those workshops will be recorded.
Yeah, and that's going to be here in Corvallis, Oregon at Oregon State University. Okay, we have several more questions here. You mentioned medium density farming, Mark. Could you explain what you mean by that?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Somebody wanted to know what medium density farming is.
Oh, I don't recall actually
Okay.
saying that. I think I said medium scale or medium intensity.
Oh, intensity, yeah. Okay. Hopefully
Yeah,
that
I think it
helps
briefly
clarify that.
This is something. Oh, I think I was talking about, my own garden and then small scale farming where you're trying to make a living, but it's not large scale industrial. I'm not sure. I don't recall having said that.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Let's see. Let me go through the questions a little further here. I have to scroll through. Okay. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on how we can keep seeds open source?
I'll let you take that one, Jared.
Sure. Well, I know, Alice, you linked to some good information on intellectual property
Yeah, that's in
generally,
the chat box. It just kind of explains the world of intellectual property rights in seed production.
I think that so there, as Mark talked about, there's this effort around the open source seed initiative, which is, where many independent and university plant breeders are kind of pledging their varieties to be open source, and um, it's a viral contract, so that if anyone uses the material, any of the varieties that are Aussie pledged in their own breeding programs, those in turn become open source. I think that but kind of the bigger context of how do we keep as much of our plant genetic diversity in the commons, where we can all be able to use it and breed from it and make improvements to deal with the challenges that we face. That is, I think a lot of it really will come down to pushing back against some of the most restrictive intellectual property that exists. I think that the open source, the open source seed initiative, is good and important. I also think that, that the Plant Variety Protection Act, as it currently stands, is something that still allows for innovation because you're allowed to breed out of it. It's really as Mark talked about, the utility patents that are one of the biggest threats to the utility patents, and the contracts that often come in hand with seeds that are the biggest threats. And I think that, as a community, there needs to be more pushback so that both so that we can do a better job of advocating. And our OSA's advocacy director, Kiki Hubbard, is certainly someone to get in touch with in terms of working on campaigns against those things. But also, seed companies do respond, and hearing from their buyers that say, why do all of your lettuce varieties have utility patents attached to them, starts to maybe make the seed companies feel a little bit of the, I guess, cost associated with releasing everything as utility patented, that there actually is maybe some consumer pushback, that there may be some leverage to be had there.
This is Mark. I just want to quickly ask you, Jared, once a seed is open source, doesn't that mean that there's no way that anyone can patent either that seed or anything developed from it? Like, so, if you make a variety open source, then that means that a private corporation can't take that seed, breed their own variety, and lock it up.
So Mark, that is the way that the open source works right now. Is it's a pledge. It may or may not really be legally binding.
I see.
But certainly to dive into the weeds just for a tiny bit, when the initial open source seed initiative concept was developed, it was developed mirroring the open source work in software, where you can have this open source license, and all of it's tied up to contracts where you basically, when you're acquiring a seed or where you're acquiring software, you agree to a certain contract, and that contract can specify, okay, by getting this seed, I agree that I'm going to not patent this, and anything I develop with it, I'm not going to patent. However, when we had lawyers involved, in order to make a legally defensible contract, that turned into like a 7-page thing that would have to be attached to every single packet of seed that was ever transferred, which was, we pictured like this little fold out thing like you would get with your pill bottles, right? And it just wasn't logistically workable. So we moved it back to a pledge, so that it's and there's some argument that pledge could still stand in court, or at least is a deterrent enough that companies wouldn't want to test it. And use that material to develop patented things, because they don't want to have to fight about that. So the short answer is, if something is Aussie pledged, in principle at least, it's protected from being patented.
Complicated.
Yeah. Okay, how much of a factor are, or factors here, are day length and latitude in establishing breeding populations?
Ooh, that's a detailed question. I'll let you take that one, Jared.
Sure. So I would say that in short, it depends a lot on the crop.
Yeah.
So some crops are you know, are they're divided based on things like day length and latitude, or growing degree days, and those kind of uh, geographic uh, parameters are super constraining in terms of what can be grown where. So things like onions, for example, there are regions where you've got short day and long day onions, and never the twain shall meet kind of thing. However, other crops are much more plastic and can be grown all across the country, or there will be other criteria that are much more important in terms of determining, okay, we have similar summer temperatures or similar disease pressures, even though these are at different latitudes or on other sides of the country. The crops may the environments may be comparable in terms of what the most important environmental constraints on growing that crop are. So again, yeah, short answer, depends on the crop. Some crops it's super important, some crops it really is not very important.
I know that
Okay.
soybeans have like 8 or 10 different maturity groups, and it's based on latitude and
Right.
day.
Yep.
Very nice.
Okay, let's see, I think this is the last question here. How does a rolling hillside affect the soil and production of crops?
Well, of course, hillsides are prone to erosion, and there are some basic conservation practices. I mean, if you're on really steep land, or if your soil is super erodible, like in certain kinds of silt loams erode more readily, then you probably want to just go into a perennial system. For more moderate situations, you maybe want to do some kind of strip cropping, perhaps alternating perennial sod crops with annual crops. Or if you're on a hillside, you could be planting orchard or vineyard and making sure that the alleys are covered in permanent sod. Jared, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe there's a whole lot in plant genetics other than the general notion of root biomass and root density that could production on, could aid erosion control on a hillside.
Yeah, I mean, just spitballing here, if I was thinking about that, I would think about the speed of kind of canopy closure, so that you've got you don't have as much bare soil that's getting directly hit by rain. Yeah, I would think about the, like you said, kind of the root mass, and also kind of the root architecture. How is it fibrous and spreading versus having it a tap root. Yeah, and then yeah, I guess, yeah, what else would I think about? I guess, I mean, those are the two things that just come to the top of my head, but I haven't thought very hard about it. It's a good question.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's see, we have a new question here. Do you know of any research that's been done? I think I have something to tell this person after the webinar, because I think I know of some research that is going on to compare the root biomass or architecture of PPB bred crops with commonly used varieties. This person's from Manitoba, Canada, and she coordinates a PPB program for wheat and oats for organic farms across Canada. We're testing our lines against checks, but root work is very expensive and labor intensive, so I'm curious. I have to check on what I thought might be somebody doing something like that.
Yeah, I imagine root work is pretty demanding. Jared or Dawn, do you have any data on root mass and results of participatory plant breeding?
I do not. I could point. my boss, Michaela Colley, has been doing some work on studying roots in carrots, but also in other crops. And there's kind of probably the questioner already has done a little bit of looking into some of the different tools out there. I have also looked into how to rapidly screen things for root traits, and there's a lot. Short answer is it even the fastest methods still take a lot of work. The kind of the classic, I think it was developed out of Penn State. There's sort of the shovelomics protocols that were developed for corn initially, but people have been adapting to other crops. And then there's a bunch of new kind of imaging based methods that are being developed, but still it's a matter of getting the roots excavated in some kind of efficient manner, and that's not easy.
One thing I would say is that these new corn varieties developed at Mondawmin Institute, one of the traits they tend to exhibit is a deep, extensive root system that enhances drought tolerance. And also there's something called parenchyma, or roots that transmit air into the soil. And this seems to enhance some of the nitrogen fixing capacity of these corn varieties. So there's definitely quite a bit of root morphology enhancement going on in that particular line of breeding work.
I also want to mention that we're having a webinar in just a couple of weeks on April 10th on corn breeding for organic markets, in which Walter Goldstein of Mondawmin Institute is participating, along with two researchers, Martin Bone and Bill Davison from the University of Illinois. So if you're interested in that and would like to find out more, I definitely would encourage everyone to attend that webinar, and you can easily find it by just Googling webinars by eOrganic, where you can find all of our recorded webinars and everything else that we've produced over the years, many of which are about organic plant breeding and seed production. So I'd like to thank everyone who joined the webinar for all those great questions. And I'd also really particularly like to thank Jared and Dawn for joining us today for the Q&A. And of course, I'd like to thank Mark for delivering this series. And there are still quite a few other webinars in this series, which you are all automatically registered for when you registered for this webinar. And we hope you can all join us for those. We'll have the recording up in about a week or so. And you can also find the slides and additional presentation notes at the link that's on your screen. And we'll also be sending you the link to that when we send you a link to the follow-up survey. So thank you to everyone for participating in the webinar, and we hope to see you next time.
Yeah, thank you.